Our next speaker is Mr. Gary Banks, and Gary is chair of the Productivity Commission. He's been the chair since the Productivity Commission's inception and was reappointed most recently in April last year. In addition to overseeing the Commission's activities, he's personally headed national inquiries on such topics as national competition policy, the national reform agenda, the economic implications of an ageing Australia. I must say that I'm getting a bit tired of this term ageing. I prefer experienced. Gary's also chaired the Australian Government's Regulation Task Force in 2006, and he's currently presiding over the Productivity Commission's inquiry into the gambling industry and executive remuneration. He chairs the Intergovernmental Steering Committee for the Review of Government Services and was the initial convener for its report on Indigenous disadvantage. In 1998, he was a member of the West Review of Higher Education. In 2007, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for services to the development of public policy in microeconomic reform and regulation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gary Banks.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to Eric Sidoti and the Whitlam Institute for inviting me here. I feel that I've had a succession of hard acts to follow. Well, when Eric first invited me, he must have known that he was making me an offer that I couldn't refuse. First of all, the topic, markets free but not beyond government intervention, is an important one. I mean, it involves a recognition that markets have obviously a very important role to play, but also, as other speakers have indicated, that governments too have an important role to play, and it's particularly important to get the mix right for the sake of the community benefit in the longer term. I've spent much of my career puzzling in that territory, and indeed that is the credo of the Productivity Commission itself. I guess the second reason why this was an offer I couldn't refuse was that it is an event hosted by an institution named after Gough Whitlam. And after all, it was Gough Whitlam who really began the process of opening up Australia's economy to the global market. He was the first Australian leader, I think, to act on the understanding that a freer, more competitive market would facilitate greater economic efficiency and productivity, which would in turn underpin income growth and pay for the social programs that can address inequality and disadvantage. In a cat's cry of the time, I remember the phrase that government cannot redistribute what its economy does not produce. Whitlam saw clearly that the pursuit of economic efficiency and social progress were complementary. And it was Whitlam who dealt the first blow against Fortress Australia with the 25% tariff cut in 1973. And while it had multiple rationales and it was partially reversed in following years, it was a politically brave, indeed unprecedented gesture that demonstrated what was possible and contributed greatly to the developments in policy thinking that saw the next Labor government a decade later pick up where Whitlam had left off and succeed in opening up the Australian economy on a more sustained basis. Now, these further reforms and the reforms that have occurred since then were Whitlam's legacy in another way. Whitlam understood and acted on the knowledge that policy reforms to promote efficiency and community well-being are often stymied by vocal minorities who stand to lose, while not being adequately appreciated by the much larger section of the community who are the ultimate beneficiaries. He created the Industries Assistance Commission out of the old Tariff Board to expose such claims to careful analysis and public scrutiny and thereby promote a more informed political decision-making in a more neutralised political environment where the trade-offs in reform could be better appreciated by the community. Now, at this point I must declare my own interest, because my first job was with Whitlam's Industries Assistance Commission, and after doing various other things, my current job is with its descendant, the Productivity Commission? Well, the basis for my affinity, I think, is clear. Well, as mentioned, the assigned title of my talk, Markets Free but Not Beyond Intervention, can be interpreted as a simple recognition of reality, a statement of fact. I can't think of any market in Australia which is not subject to intervention of some kind. Indeed, some markets could be said to be creatures of regulation, depending on it for their very existence. And the carbon pollution reduction scheme being the most important and I guess contentious current example of that. While some markets have only emerged through the loosening of tight regulatory constraints, and the gambling industries, about which I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment, are a good example of that. But in the shadow of the global financial crisis, you can also read into the title the implication that markets can be too free and not regulated enough. That's, I think, a reasonable position in the light of recent experience in financial markets in particular, and it leads to the big questions for public policy. How free and how much intervention, and very importantly, how should governments go about making those decisions in the best interests of the community? Well, in seeking to address, if not completely answer those questions, I'll talk about, firstly, what purpose markets serve and their contribution to economic progress, and Australia's in particular. Secondly, the limits of markets, what they can't do, and related to that, why they retain an image problem in the midst of the prosperity that they've created or engendered. And thirdly, I'll use a couple of case studies from the current work of the Productivity Commission, to which John's just referred, executive remuneration and gambling, to illustrate some principles that should have wider application. Well, the stories that have emerged from the global financial crisis about complex financial derivative markets, as has been said, transferring risk from those who didn't care about it to those who don't understand it, together with revelations about numbers of people losing their savings in shonky investment vehicles, the failure of high-profile financial intermediaries, and indeed the erratic swings in stock markets and currency markets, are all seen by many people as markets having a fundamental problem, and that's understandable. But in reality, markets are the solution to a much bigger problem. They yield benefits that have greatly outweighed their costs, including those just experienced. Problems in markets should not be conflated or mixed up with the notion of problems of markets. It's easy to forget or lose sight of the simple function and logic of markets, a means of connecting willing buyers and sellers to their mutual benefit. That's all they do. And of course, if they do it well, they achieve a lot. But like the old saying about oils, markets ain't markets. Some operate a lot better than others. Those societies with better functioning markets have also been the most successful economically, and indeed often socially the most successful as well. Indeed, the economic progress of mankind is broadly coextensive with the evolution of markets, from localised barter to monetised transactions encompassing many people over very large distances. Now, how rapidly and effectively those markets have developed has depended in turn on the development of rules that have facilitated them and reduced the costs of transactions. The key ones being how well property rights are defined, how effectively suppliers compete, how well informed are buyers, and the nature and reach of mechanisms for legal redress when things go wrong. Through the medium of prices, competitive markets ensure that a country's resources get put to use where they can do the most good, taking account of how much people value different goods and services and how much those goods and services cost to produce. Competitive markets also ensure that the better mousetrap gets appropriately rewarded, in turn providing incentives for innovation and lower cost reduction, which underpin the growth process. The logic of markets means that all this can happen in a decentralised way, with the actions of many individuals coordinated spontaneously through the prices they face, which was Adam Smith's invisible hand. Emerging shortages and surpluses, which are inherent to any system, can be signalled in a competitive market through price movements, precipitating actions by both buyers and sellers that serve to eliminate them. If a queue persists, whether it's for taxis or hospitals, you can be sure that a well-functioning market does not. As noted, not all societies have accepted the logic of markets. However, experiments around the world with alternate systems over the years have only served to demonstrate the value of markets. And indeed, we've seen a progressive shift towards or back to markets across the globe in recent decades, which has generally paid off. For example, since 1980, world GDP has risen by 2.5 times, or an unprecedented 40% per capita, with millions of people rising out of extreme poverty. China's performance since the end of the Cultural Revolution, when it partly opened the door to markets, speaks for itself. Since the beginning of the reforms in China in 1978, we've seen real GDP in that country grow by more than 10% a year. That in turn has seen a dramatic reduction in poverty, rise in life expectancy, and in other indicators of capability like literacy and health. The OECD has said that China's advance to a market economy is among the greatest economic success stories of modern times. Now, the power of markets to produce prosperity has also been reaffirmed within market economies themselves, where impediments to markets have been relaxed or where markets have been introduced in industries or activities where they had not previously existed. And Australia itself illustrates how important it is to a country's economic performance to make good use of markets, to get the right balance between freedom and intervention. And for much of the last century, that balance shifted decidedly in favour of intervention, and successive governments imposed policies that impeded competition, distorted prices, constrained business and raised its costs. For many years, the cost of those inefficiencies that multiplied under that regime were masked by the performance of our broadacre agriculture and mining. But by 1983, when the Hawke government came into power, Australia was falling off the sheep's back. Productivity and income growth were low, deficits were becoming relatively high, and Australia's per capita GDP had slipped from 5th to 15th in the OECD. The Banana Republic beckoned, in Keating's evocative phrase. The fact that we were able to reverse our economic decline, unlike the Latin American countries that shared our top billing in the global GDP ladder at the beginning of the last century, was largely due to the policy reform process set in train by that Labor government. The key strand of those reforms was directed at freeing up markets and exposing industry to competition, allowing prices to perform their proper allocative role, while undertaking reforms to make government infrastructure services more efficient and labour markets more flexible. The resulting transformation of Australia's economy from one that was inward-looking, high-cost and inflexible to an innovative, adaptable and more competitive one resulted in a resurgence in productivity and income growth in this country, with Australia climbing back up to 8th in the OECD per capita GDP rankings by the end of the century. These reforms also, as Ken Henry indicated, created a new resilience that saw us withstand international disturbances that would have laid us low in earlier decades. And these include the Asian financial crisis, despite our great dependence at that time on Asian export markets. And no doubt they've contributed to our relative success thus far in containing the real impacts of the global financial crisis. One illustration being the ability, under more accommodating labour market regulation, for businesses to reduce labour inputs or hours without sacking workers. Well, if markets are so good, why do they often seem to perform so poorly, I can hear some people thinking. Why are markets resisted? Why have they got this image problem? Well, there are two features of competitive market processes that I think provide much of the explanation or reconciliation of that, and some earlier speakers have touched on them. One is what has become known since Schumpeter as creative destruction, survival of the economically fittest. Markets go by results. They pay no respect to good intentions and they punish poor economic performance. If a business can't deliver a product that people want, it will fail. That's the destruction bit. But its resources won't disappear or remain idle for long, at least in most circumstances. They'll eventually be absorbed by expanding businesses that are meeting the market test, and that's the creative bit. Creative destruction is inherent to the growth process, with limited resources, economies dependent on successful businesses and industries being able to attract people and capital from less successful ones. Stop that and you stop a major source of growth, and the banana republic beckons once more. But that also means that some firms will contract or even close down, some people will become unemployed, at least for a while, and some towns and regions will stagnate or decline while others prosper. That seems harsh to most people, especially to those directly affected. So we see considerable resistance to the logic of markets and indeed lobbying by industries for taxpayer support. This can be successful if the industry is influential enough or the regional politics appear to dictate it. Though governments generally know that it's better to provide people with transitional support in a dynamic economy than try to help them by making the economy less dynamic. And indeed, Australian governments have been liberal in providing such support, which have generally allowed a stable income distribution to be maintained during periods of quite dramatic structural reform. The second reason why markets have an image problem is that what the market values need not accord with what society values, or indeed even with the interests of the wider economy in the long run. Private and social valuations need not be the same. What's in the best interests of a firm or an industry may not be in the best interests of society or the economy. This can manifest itself in several ways, and four principal ones that occur to me are the following. Firstly, certain kinds of goods and services may not get adequately produced. These are known in the jargon as public goods, but another category is welfare. Secondly, certain people within society may not get access to services that are produced, like adequate health or adequate education, things that in the old days we used to refer to as merit goods. Thirdly, some production activities may be underdone, and these can be things like R&D, which are typically seen as market failures, but also things like safety within the workplace or probity within businesses. And fourthly, some production activities may be overdone. And I guess pollution, again, is a very topical example. These gaps all involve things that civilised societies care about. They have to do with fairness and quality of life. It could be said that they have to do with the productivity of societies, not just the productivity of economies. But we shouldn't condemn markets for failure to produce them. Markets have an important function, but they cannot satisfy every societal goal or need. They cannot do it all. That's why we have governments and why realistically we require those governments to perform a larger role than the minimalist functions advocated by libertarian philosophers. In addition to establishing market institutions to underpin markets, governments need to intervene to influence behaviour by market participants, and they need to provide so-called non-market services, and these things have been already talked about. While much of this intervention has been desirable, some of it has come at a high cost and has been motivated by private interests rather than the public interest. And that has been the object of the reform process from the 1980s. So we've seen a trend to the removing of impediments to competition, as well as a shift from public to private sector provision, where it's more efficient or more cost effective. And in financial markets, we've seen a greater emphasis on principle-based regulation focused on outcomes rather than prescriptive regulation focused on inputs, with more reliance on disclosure and the strengthening of overarching institutional oversight. Now, while this shift has yielded significant benefits for Australia, and our financial regulatory framework is generally seen as very robust, the global financial crisis's origins in regulatory failures overseas, together with Australia's membership of the G20 and that grouping's increased role, has meant that we are inevitably facing pressure to introduce tighter regulation in Australia. Well, that's not a bad thing. We need to continuously review regulation, particularly in areas as important as financial markets, in the light of experience. But managing this process so as to ensure that any new regulation we do introduce is appropriate to Australia's circumstances and a good fit with the existing regulatory framework will be quite challenging. There's much at stake in getting this right. Financial flows are the lifeblood of the economy. Prior to the liberalisation for the 1980s, financial markets in Australia could be said to have been very safe, but credit was costly, hard to get and poorly allocated. The relaxation of credit controls and barriers to competition drove major innovations in cost reductions that boosted economic growth and benefited many people, including low-income people. Any response in Australia to the recent excesses and poor risk management in the United States should not overlook these important benefits. They imply the need in intervening in this market to get a balance between reducing the risks and costs of financial instability and the contagion effects that can have on the real economy, and the risks and costs of reducing competition, innovation and the productivity of this key sector, and the adverse economy-wide impacts that these two would have. Well, while some areas look more prospective than others, this is Ken Henry's territory and others' territory, and the Commission hasn't done any work that would inform useful insights from me today on these very complex issues. But the challenges in getting the balance right in regulating markets, including financial markets, are illustrated by two areas that the Commission is looking at right now. One, which has its origins partly in the fallout from the global financial crisis, is executive remuneration. The other is gambling, or the gambling industries. In both, our task is to come up with a regulatory framework that bridges what is seen as a clash between the private and social values and interests in order to get better outcomes for the community as a whole. And I think both provide, hopefully, some wider lessons. Well, executive remuneration first. As many of you will know, that inquiry was triggered by a community backlash against instances of large multi-million-dollar payouts to CEOs at a time when shares were plummeting, companies were performing poorly, and many Australians were doing it tough. Many of these were characterised as payments for failure, and very healthy payments at that. CEOs were seen as feathering their own nests and taking actions to achieve that which were too short-termist or that were heightening risk, and in particular contributing to the financial problems that eventuated globally. This was a conflagration from what actually had been a smouldering issue in Australia for some time. From the early 90s through to about 2007, we saw executive remuneration for the top 100 companies treble, rising from 17 times to 50 times average weekly earnings, and indeed up to $10 million on average, or 150 times average weekly earnings for the top 10 companies. This has been seen as both inequitable and efficient, seen as the market for executive remuneration or the public companies that surround them being effectively out of control. And so governments were, I guess, on the back foot to step in and place limits on this process, including caps on remuneration. At the time when the inquiry was announced, they indicated that they were going to do that in one key area that was very contentious, and that was termination payments, as you'd be aware. But at the same time, they announced two reviews, one by APRA, which was focused specifically on the finance sector, given the contagion risks that I talked about there, and secondly, the one by the Commission, which looked at executive remuneration generally, but particularly outside the finance sector. Well, by now you've seen where the Commission came out with its report, or at least you've read about it. We found that there were deficiencies warranting additional regulation, but as indeed with APRA, we saw the importance in the regulatory actions that needed to be taken of strengthening decision-making within markets rather than overriding the market with controls on outcomes, which we saw as potentially having high costs and risks. The facts are that there are 2,000 public companies in Australia. The multi-million-dollar pay packets that get all the attention are largely confined to the top 1 or 2%. Big pay is mainly a big company story in Australia. As I indicated, the top 10 CEOs have average pay packets of $10 million or more, but the bottom 500 have remuneration of around $180,000, or only 3 times average weekly earnings. And even the top CEOs were found not to be highly paid, believe it or not, by international standards. Their remuneration is well below that in the USA, which admittedly is an outlier internationally, was found to be closer to the remuneration of CEOs in the smaller European countries, and again well below that in the UK. Remuneration, executive remuneration, also varies considerably by sector, where we've seen no opening of the divergence with average earnings in the mining sector, for example, where the divergence has been quite great in the finance sector. And while there was very rapid growth in executive remuneration in the roaring 90s, that slowed in the 2000s, with total remuneration falling by 13% in 07-08 and by about 20% in 08-09 in response to the impacts of the global financial crisis. In its research, the Commission found that for every 10% increase in the size of a company, according to its market cap value, CEO pay rises by 4%. And that was a very consistent finding across countries. Bigger companies pay more to compensate for greater job complexity and the greater ramifications of decision-making in that job. Large companies compete for the best people because even a little difference in the quality of decisions or the strategic judgments that are made could mean millions of dollars worth of additional profit or returns to shareholders. Well, it's understandable, nevertheless, that there's a sense of disbelief or even grievance in the community at the headline numbers that appear in the newspapers relating to executive pay, particularly for those top 1 or 2%. And I think we'd all agree, or most of us would agree, no doubt, that many of those CEOs and highly paid executives are earning more than they need. But the question for policy is whether what they're earning is excessive from an economic efficiency perspective. Efficiency in a market requires that all the potentially most valuable transactions take place. So on the one hand, paying a premium above the reservation wage, if you can call a multi-million-dollar packet a reservation wage, to secure the right managers can indeed be efficient, with the extra pay merely representing a deduction from the extra surpluses that they hopefully would generate. Whether they always achieve that, of course, is another matter. On the other hand, efficiency would be reduced if executives can exert influence on their own remuneration beyond their actual scarcity value, or if boards get the incentive structures wrong, and in particular in the financial sector, that can lead to problems which can contaminate the performance of the wider economy, as we've seen. But even if it's outside the financial sector, if it occurs in enough companies, it can contaminate the community's trust in equity investments and the public company model itself.